Alright, hello and welcome back to another old school Magic the Gathering deck tech. Today we're looking at Dead Guy Red, played by Jon Finkel, Ben Rubin in the 1998 World Championships. I'm playing Jon Finkel's exact list. These are not gold bordered cards, these are all the real cards. I had these cards previously. Ben Rubin actually made the finals with a slightly different build. His build consisted of, I want to say it was like Goblin Vandals, Mog Flunkies, and a Viashino Sandstalker, and I like Jon Finkel's build better. Jon Finkel's different cards are the Fire Slingers, from what I remember. An extra hammer and an extra land, from what I remember, if that's correct. Object of this deck is to reduce your opponent's life total down to 0 as quick as possible. One of the most best designed sligh decks at the time. The Tempest block introduced some very powerful 1-drop red creatures in addition of Mog Fanatic and Jackal Pup, which kind of like defined the format for a little while, including Curse Scroll, which was a huge one. Curse Scroll is absolutely huge, but we're going to examine the deck card by card, so let's get to it real quick. Deck consists of 22 lands, and 19 creatures, and 19 burn spells. So let's examine it card by card. First up is Mog Fanatic. 1 mana, 1/1. You can sacrifice it, deal 1 damage, target creature or player. Cool thing about this guy was that damage actually stacked back then. So you could actually trade with a 1/1 or a 2/1, actually trade with the creature and still deal damage to a target creature or player. That's why he was so good in this deck. Moving on, Jackal Pup was clearly one of the most defining best creatures of all time for red 1-drops in red. Obviously other than Goblin Guide, for instance, but the fact that this had a power ratio, it was bigger than its casting cost. It was a 2 mana, the 2/1 for 1 was already good enough, but it had one very slight drawback in the fact that for every damage that it got dealt, it would deal 1 damage to you. But because of the fact that this came down on turn 1, it meant that by the time it died, it would usually deal like 4 to 6 points of damage before it would die. So it was clearly worth being in the deck for that reason. Ironclaw Orcs was what you call your red grizzly bear. 2 mana, 2/2. The only minor downfall is that it cannot block creatures with power greater than 1. So his sole objective was just to keep attacking. I mean, you would never want it to block anyway, so it was not really that much of a downfall. Sometimes you would want to block with it, but I mean, you couldn't. So, very strong card in the deck. You would use your burn spells to clear the path for him just to keep attacking. So, that was his role in the deck. Fire Slinger, it runs 3. This guy is 2 mana, 1/1. It was a pinger. The fact that it dealt 1 damage to target creature or player and 1 damage to you, he was good because he killed like the shadow creatures, and he was like your Birds of Paradise killer early on in the game. He was the guy that dealt that much more damage to you, to your opponent when they would start playing walls and stuff. So he was actually a very good creature in this deck. I liked him a lot. The fact that he came down on turn 2 and he could start pinging right away. He could also ping ball lightnings if needed. He was just all around solid creature in the deck. Next and final creature, the heavy hitter of the deck, Ball Lightning. 3 red mana, 6/1. Trample, unaffected by summoning sickness, slash haste. At the end of a turn, you have to sacrifice it. So the idea behind this card was that since it dealt 6 damage for 3 mana, you'd usually want to cast it when your opponent is tapped out. That way they can't use removal spells on it. And sometimes if your opponent had creatures, it would be okay, because if they would even block, because the idea is that they would still take trample damage behind that. So this combined with Fire Blast actually was You would hit them with Ball Lightning for 6, sacrifice 2 mountains, and deal 4 damage of Fire Blast. That was 10 damage, so that was half your opponent's life total already. So I think that's where they got the name Dead Guy Red from. I'm pretty sure, but that's pretty much all the creatures in the deck. 19 creatures. Let's go on to the burn spells now. 4 shocks is what you call your somewhat fair version of a lightning bolt. It didn't get reprinted, I believe, in 5th edition. They just thought it was too strong. So when Stronghold came around, they made shock. 1 less point of damage, but it was still at 1 mana, instant, 2 damage. Good at killing small creatures. Moving on, you got Incinerate. This was your lightning bolt back then. 1 more mana, 2 mana. Deals 3 damage to target creature or player. If the creature was damaged by Incinerate, it couldn't regenerate this turn, so I don't remember that much creatures that actually had a regeneration back then. It was very few. And the ones that mostly had a regeneration were mostly played in limited. But all around, it was just a very strong card. 3 damage was still a good chunk. If needed, sometimes, you would go to the head and, finish your opponent off that way. But now we're moving on to the more late game cards in Hammer Borgarden and Curse Scroll. Hammer Borgarden was good because it was 3 mana, it was a sorcery. You could deal 3 damage to target creature or player. The cool thing was, in the late game, when you had a lot of mana going, you could pay 3 red, 2 colorless, bring it back from your graveyard to your hand during your upkeep. So once you got enough mana, it was like 3 damage a turn, which was more than Curse Scroll, actually. So this was kind of like your alternate win condition against the Recurring Nightmare Survival of the Fittest decks. They would just play like a bunch of walls or something, and so Hammer Borgarden and Curse Scroll are like your alternate routes. So speaking of Curse Scroll, the most dominant artifacts and one of the most dominant cards actually came out of the Tempest block. 1 mana came down early, and then you could pay 3 mana, you name a card. Target opponent chooses a card at random from your hand. If they choose the named card, it will deal 2 damage to creature or player, so it was a shock. Now, the cool thing about this card was that if you only had 1 card in hand, it was always 2 damage. And you combine that, with more burn spells like Hammer, Incinerate. It was just that much more damage. The Curse Scroll was actually really good because it would kill the protection from red creatures because Curse Scroll is colorless. It could deal with the Soltari Priest. It could deal with the Paladin and Vec. The only thing you really had to watch out for was Imperial Armor. Imperial Armor would pump it up, too big to burn out. So your best bet was to kill it with Curse Scroll. You also have 1 Torture Chamber in the sideboard. I'll get to that card in a minute. But that's pretty much it. Straightforward deck. One of my most favorite decks of all time to play casually a lot. Had a very good mana curve. Fire Blast was insane. 6 mana, deals 4 damage to target creature or player. You can sacrifice 2 mountains instead of paying its casting cost. Like I said, this combined with Ball Lightning was half your opponent's life total already. This card was hard to play around because you never know when your opponent would, use the mountains to sacrifice it. So this was a tough card to play around back then, but it was just overall very strong. Going up to the mana base, and the mana base is nothing special. I'm running Ghost Quarters instead of Wastelands. The Ghost Quarters are supposed to be Wastelands. I'm just not running Wastelands because it's no shock to anybody that Wasteland is like $80-something, and I don't want to play the Wastelands in this deck. Just to get a chance to damage them. But they're just Wastelands. They do technically the same thing pretty much. And then 18 Mountains. They're all the same art. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much the whole deck in a nutshell, really. Just play very aggressive, throw down some creatures, use your burn spells to clear the way if needed, and use your burn spells to finish your opponent off. Alright, so let's look at the sideboard real quick. Let's start off with Bottle Gnomes. 3 mana, 1/3 artifact creature. You could sacrifice it, gain 3 life. This was like your mirror match card. You would board out the Jackal Pups, I feel, and bring these in because you need the life gain in that matchup. That's the only thing I could really think of. This was for the mirror match. Pyroblast. I got 2 red elemental blasts, but it's technically the same thing. Pyroblast comes in the mono blue counterspell decks. Pretty much you just want to, like, if they try to dissipate your hammer, you can protect it with Pyroblast. If you want to counterspell, say, a Capsize, you want them to stop bouncing your stuff. So, I mean, it had a lot of uses, but it was pretty much the mono blue control decks. It was also a way to counter the Chill enchantment. The Chill was a nightmare because it made all the red spells cost 2 more. I can't exactly remember if Chill was actually out then. I could be wrong on that, but I think this is why this was probably a 4 of, if that existed back then. But that's the 2 primary things I could think of to get rid of the Chill and the mono blue control decks. Shattering Pulse, basically a shatter with an upgrade. Pay 3, buy it back. I'm not really too sure if this was necessary in the mirror. I mean, best thing I think of to kill was a Cursed Scroll usually, or any other. I mean, that was the best thing to kill back then, but there's probably some other annoying artifacts. Phyrexian Furnace, your so-called Relic of Progenitus back then. This was your way to get around the Recurring Nightmare decks. If you have this in play before Recurring Nightmare, they try to reanimate a creature, and you could remove a target, any card, not just, a creature or whatever. Exile it, and then you get to draw a card. It comes down early, it starts removing cards from their graveyard, from the bottom of their library. So this was pretty much against the Phyrexian Furnace decks. The Recurring Nightmare, Survival of the Fittest decks. And it was actually not that bad in the mirror either, because you could exile a Hammer of Garden if needed. So, not a bad card. Torture Chamber, this was an interesting one to have. I know why it's in the deck, but a 3 mana artifact. During your upkeep, you put a pain counter on it, and at the end of your turn, Torture Chamber deals 1 damage to you for each pain counter on it. And then you could pay 1 mana, remove all pain counters from Torture Chamber, and deal 1 damage for each pain counter on it to target creature. So this was, I know for a fact this was primarily for the protection from red creatures. Paladin, Vex, Soltari Priest. The idea is to get around it, dealing you damage. If they have like a 2/1 guy, like say it's 2/1 Soltari Priest, you would play this. Next turn, you put a counter on it, and then remove the counter right away, and then kill it. And then the Torture Chamber will not deal you damage. So it was to me, it was like a little risky, I think. But since it was an artifact, I guess it was somewhat necessary. You don't want more than 1 copy; it would just be, too clunky. So I think 1 copy was correct. But that's what it was missioned for, was to kill the protection from red guys. Because since this deck is all red, you don't want to face those guys if you're playing a mono red deck. And Final Fortune is our very last sideboard card. 2 red mana instant. You take another turn after this one, and you lose the game at the end of the turn. So this card you would bring in for your worst matchups. I would say it's probably not that bad in the mirror either. It was just like one of those cards where it was like designed against combo decks, or pretty much it's there so when you're about to lose and if you're about to win, you could actually try to get 1 more draw step and try to draw that crucial burn spell or that ball lightning. If the game goes real long, you could set it up to where like you already have your hammer in the graveyard. You Final Fortune, bring it back, hammer them, try to hope to draw another burn spell. So it was just there to get around your worst matchups and just when you just try to really desperately need to draw your one last burn spell to end the game. I'm not really too sure how much Jon Finkel actually used this throughout the Swiss, but anyways, that's pretty much it. That's the sideboard, and that's the main deck. The deck is very straightforward. Very fun deck. Hammerborg Garden is one of my most favorite Magic cards of all time. Has a lot of flavor. It was very expensive back then too. It was like $15 back then or something like that back in the day around this time, I think. Everything else is pretty. I mean, the Curse Scrolls were obviously pretty expensive back then. So it was actually a pretty cheap deck to build, I think, back then. But overall, very powerful, very fun. I'm going to include this deck in the Versus series, so you guys be on the lookout for that. And that's it. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about this deck, and thanks for watching.